we are going to hear from a policy researcher from a famous Washington think tank. Our third speaker is Dr. James J. MacKenzie, Senior Associate for Climate, Energy, and Pollution Program at the World Resources Institute. Dr. MacKenzie is a recognized expert in the relationship between the automobile and the environment. He is the author of a fascinating book, which I read, even though it is in English, and which I also recommend you to read. This book is titled The Keys to the Car, Electric and Hydrogen Vehicles for the 21st Century. Dr. MacKenzie also co-authored the book Car Travel, which explores the impacts of cars on the American scene. In several major World Resources Institute reports, he has analyzed how America has subsidized the automobiles, the impacts of global motor vehicle use on the climate change, and the effect of multiple air pollutants on U.S. forests and crops. He is also concerned about the nation's energy security. In response to the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Dr. MacKenzie wrote papers on the need for a structure of a national energy strategy. Prior to joining the World Resources Institute, Dr. MacKenzie was a senior staff scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. During the Carter administration, he served as a senior staff member for energy at the President's Council on Environmental Quality, where he co-authored reports on solar energy, conservation, and global warming. Before that, Dr. MacKenzie was a member of the joint scientific staff of the Massachusetts and the National Audubon Society. Dr. MacKenzie received his PhD in physics from the University of Minnesota. He completed postgraduate work at Los Alamos and Argonne National Laboratories, as well as Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I personally know that Dr. MacKenzie practices Aikido, which is a traditional Japanese martial art, and he has many Japanese friends. Dr. MacKenzie, please come to the podium, and please give him a very warm welcome. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matsumoto. It's a pleasure to be here. World Resources is a nonprofit NGO, a non-government organization with programs in climate, energy, and pollution, which I participate, biological resources, economics and population, technology, environment, and human resources and environmental information. And it's in this arena that I have worked on transportation for several years now, where most of these ideas come from today. There are about 700 million cars and trucks in the world, and that number is growing daily. About 100 million of those are motorcycles. And I'm not going to dwell on all the benefits that they confer. They're well known to us: the mobility, ability to go where you want, when you want, to locate manufacturing facilities away from markets, and so on. So the benefits are well known and certainly appreciated. But what we also have to appreciate is the problems they create. And these problems are principally air pollution, about which we've heard a lot already today, congestion, accidents, global warming, as well as dependence on oil in this country, increasingly from the Persian Gulf, and in Japan, increasingly from the Persian Gulf as well. Now, there have been many attempts to reduce these problems, and we've heard about those as well, especially the problems of air pollution. But what we find is that we are running against the tide, that there is, because of growth in the vehicle fleet in this country, Japan, and globally, that our progress has been very limited in dealing with it. In some cases, it's been very small indeed. Growth is the underlying problem. If we didn't have it, we would have cleaned up the air in this country a long time ago, but in fact, we are making much less progress than the numbers might indicate on paper. There are three problems that I'd like to talk about this afternoon quickly, a little bit more quickly perhaps because of our time. The first one is the air pollution problem. The second one is global warming and resources. And then I'd like to say a few words about the congestion problems and perhaps some of the technologies that might be able to address them. The three problems that are related to fuels are pollution, climate, and security. And yet these problems are dealt with in the political arena quite separately, quite distinctly, if at all. Most of the attention on alternative fuels is in relation to the air pollution problems that motor vehicles generate. And we've heard about those already this afternoon. Quite separately is the issue of motor vehicles' contribution to global warming, which is quite substantial. In this country, motor vehicles account for about a fourth of greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon dioxide emissions. And worldwide, it's about 15%. And this is a very rapidly growing sector. And yet, in the political context, the two of them are quite distinct. In our Congress, one committee that deals with air pollution, and almost no one that deals with climate in any serious way. So we get policies and we get programs that are not complementary to one another as we try and deal with these problems that are in fact closely linked together. Air pollution we've heard about this afternoon, pardon me. Carbon monoxide, which is a problem of health and which also contributes indirectly to global warming. We've heard that so much of this is due to motor vehicles worldwide. It's true in the developing world where the growth is occurring most rapidly. It's true in the developed countries as well. Hydrocarbons and NOx, nitrogen oxides, are also very major sources of motor vehicles. They give rise to ozone, which is a health problem, which attacks people's lungs. Autopsies on people living in high pollution areas have shown the kinds of damages that occur from heavy smoking. Ozone damages crops, materials, and when the nitrogen oxides, which are necessary to form ozone, leave the atmosphere, they turn into nitric acid, so they form part of our acid rain problem as well. Now, over time, we have tried to deal with this problem. We've heard that today. Beginning in 1970, there have been a series of programs in the U.S. fleet to reduce emissions, so that today the hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide of new vehicles is maybe 1/5 or 1/10 that of vehicles of 25 years ago, and nitrogen oxides maybe reduced 75%. And yet we still have serious problems. And partly the problem is that automobiles deteriorate. Emission systems deteriorate over time. And so we find that when tests are made that many of the cars on the road are emitting hydrocarbons, which are necessary for ozone formation, at 3 times the level in which they're certified. Also, recent studies have shown that at least half the cars that on the road have had their systems tampered with. In other words, they've either been removed or they've been adjusted by the owners in a way that has caused increase in pollution. And then there are some sources, such as evaporation from tanks, that simply were not appreciated before. And so we find that we haven't made as much progress, and it's a continuing battle to try and reduce emissions in this country. The new sophisticated inspection programs are being resisted strongly by people who feel very violated by the need to bring their cars in and have long 15-minute detailed inspections of their emission systems. So we are running into political problems with trying to make more progress. And growth is going to only make this problem worse. I have some overheads which I'm not going to use, but they are in the handout which you have in your package. And if you'd like to follow some of the some of these figures along, it'll perhaps be easier than trying to read them from a distance. Growth is going to be the problem that contributes most to these problems. And in the first figure, you see that growth has gone from 246 million vehicles in 1970 to almost 600 in 1990. And if these present trends continue, there'll be well over 1 billion by the year 2010. And so it's this growth that has overwhelmed all the progress we've tried to make in cleaning up vehicles. And California has shown to what extremes you have to go to deal with the growth problem. They have standards which are even more stringent than the federal standards, and yet they also have the air pollution, which is the worst in the country by far, and it's because the fleet continues to increase. Air pollution, and I'll deal with how we're going to address these different problems after I describe them individually. Air pollution is only one of the problems. Motor vehicles are important sources of global warming gases. As I already mentioned, carbon dioxide is one. Ozone is a greenhouse gas. The CFCs in the air conditioners are CFC gases. They give rise, the catalytic converters give rise to nitrous oxide, which is a very long-lived greenhouse gas. In other words, they're major sources from that point as well. Perhaps carbon dioxide is the most serious of these because it contributes most to the global warming problem. And this problem is growing worldwide. As you see in figure 2, carbon dioxide emissions are increasing and have been for over 20 years, which is the latest data that I have, showing increasing by about 17 million tons of carbon per year. And there's absolutely no signs that this is going to slow down. There's enormous growth occurring in the world fleet, and that growth is shown in the next figure, figure 3. The growth is not so much in the developed world as it is in the developing countries, especially in Asia. And so the prospects of dealing with this problem mean that we're going to have to work against this enormous growth that is occurring. Just as has been the case with air pollution, cars have become more efficient. And the next figure, figure 4, shows how the fuel consumed per vehicle in the worldwide fleet has declined exponentially since 1970. It has gone down about 1.5% per year. So the fleet is getting more efficient. The problem is that we're adding vehicles at a faster rate than we can deal with through this new car improvement, and as a result, emissions continue to increase. And if these trends continue, by the year 2010, we calculate in one of our papers that carbon dioxide from motor vehicles worldwide will increase 20 to 50% relative to their levels in 1987. Now, that has to be compared with what you have to do as a world to safeguard the climate, by which I mean reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 60 to 80% below present levels if we're going to stabilize the climate. Stabilizing emissions of carbon dioxide at today's levels will not stop the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. We have to reduce them by an enormous amount. And this has obvious implications for the world fleet of motor vehicles, as well as other sectors of the world economy, especially electric power production, which is the other rapidly growing source of carbon dioxide. The prospect of meeting the climate goals are very dim indeed. According to a new report from the International Energy Agency, there will be 30 to 40% greater emissions of carbon dioxide from all sources by the year 2010 than there were in the year 1990. And a growth rate from vehicles, they will even be greater than what we estimated. They think there will be 50 to 60% greater in the year 2010 than there were in the year 1990. So, once again, with all good intentions to improve the vehicle fleet, and this includes the administration's attempts to reinvent the car and triple efficiency, all of that, in my view, is going to not prevail against the growth in the fleet. And so I think that we are, it's a problem that we haven't really seriously addressed, and yet it looms there. The next problem, which I would like to refer to, is one that is very rarely discussed at all, and that is the adequacy of global oil resources to deal in the long term with the refueling this fleet. It's not a problem that is discussed, and yet we know it's a matter of when, not if, that global oil production will peak. Today, petroleum supplies meets about 40% of energy needs of the world, and more and more, about a third of this oil goes to motor vehicle use. It's about 40% in developed countries and about half in the U.S. What I'd like to do is present some very simple arguments as to why I believe that world production will peak sometime between the year 2000 and the year 2010, if rapid growth in demand continues. These arguments are basically an extension of simple analytic arguments made by a deceased U.S. geologist named King Hubbard. And figure 5 shows the kind of pattern of cumulative consumption you would expect using a non-renewable resource. Basically, as time goes on, you use more and more. This is the total that is consumed up to a given time. And as the resource is depleted, it eventually levels off at the total amount that is eventually to be extracted from the earth. If you look at the lower 48 states, oil production, the history, which is in the next figure, figure 6, you're astonished at how closely, in fact, the history of U.S. production follows such a curve. For years now, I've been keeping track of this on my home computer, and it always converges to the same number, 189 billion barrels. I don't know whether it's going to diverge from that, but so far, it is very strongly suggestive that the United States is about 85% through its oil resources, and the figure 7 shows, in fact, the history of production, how it has been declining since 1970, and this is despite the fact that between 1970 and the mid-80s, the price of oil was very high, exploration efforts were very high, and yet reserves continued to decline, and production continued to decline as well. So one might add, well, what does this have to do with global oil resources? And the answer is straightforward. A number of, I've worked on this problem for a number of years as well. If you ask how much oil is likely to be recovered in the world over all time, the answer is, well, no one knows for sure, but you can look at all the oil basins in the world and you can make estimates with a range and then add it up and see what it comes to. And it turns out that for the past 25 years, there has been remarkable agreement that there is something like 2,000 billion barrels of oil that will ultimately be recovered from the earth. And the lowest of the range estimate is about 1,600, and the highest I've seen is about 2,400. And the difference is huge. The difference is 800 billion barrels, but it turns out it doesn't make that much difference in terms of the questions that you ask as to when oil production is likely to peak. The most recent set of estimates is done by the U.S. Geological Survey, which was a 10-year effort. And they concluded that it was someplace between 1,800 and about 2,500 billion barrels. The high values is very optimistic. It assumes that there will be all new technology that will be developed that will increase the recovery rate, that there will be some supergiants that are found out there. Other studies, very important studies, come to some lower estimates. Richard Nearing, who worked for the Rand Corporation in a major study, concluded it was someplace between 1,600 and 2,000 barrels, 2,000 billion barrels. And Joseph Reber of the Congressional Research Service estimates about 1,800 billion. Colin Campbell of Petro Consultants estimates even lower, about 1,600 billion barrels, based on some very sophisticated calculations. If you take this estimate and simply use the same kinds of techniques that are proven so successful in the U.S., you get something like a figure on 18. Figure 18 shows the history of world oil production up through 1994, and it shows two possible futures. The one that's marked 2007, 9 billion barrels is the median estimate of the Geological Survey, and the high estimate is 2,477. And these blocks, these little squiggles in there, the IEA and DOE are estimates of world production, world demand in the year 2000, 2005, and 2010. And what you find from this is that under the most optimistic of assumptions, namely that there's most oil, say 2,500 billion, and low demand, that in the year about 2012, world production will start to loosen. This is the highest. It could very well occur earlier. According to a major study done by Petro Consultants in the Middle East earlier this year, they think it will happen closer to the year 2000 because they think that the Persian Gulf states have overstated their resources. At any rate, I am by no means alone in these conclusions. The paper by Shell Oil Company recently, the retired CEO, John Bookout, said, quote, oil production is projected to continue to grow in the near term at a rate of about 1% per year to a peak of about 75 million barrels a day around the year 2010. Now, not to say that global oil is suddenly going to run out. The point is that the limits of the resource are in sight. We are entering the end of the middle part of the global oil era. And this has enormous implications for the automobile, because that is what runs on oil. I mean, almost all the vehicles in this country, from airplanes to motor vehicles, run on oil. And if we are going to avoid, already oil prices are going to start tightening over the next couple of years because OPEC is trying to raise money. The prices are low. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait are political problems. And so one should look forward to higher prices anyhow. But this kind of peaking is likely and has ramifications for the kinds of technologies we're going to develop to deal with the other problems, namely air quality as well as climate change. The alternative fuels not only discuss the solutions that are being proposed and how most of them do not fit the problems, as a matter of fact. Most of the fuels that are being promoted deal only with air quality. And they are methanol, compressed natural gas, and ethanol. Methanol is made from natural gas today. It's about the same greenhouse gas effect as carbon dioxide. It is not a solution to that particular problem. As proposed in the United States, methanol would not be used as pure methanol. It would be mixed with gasoline so that you could get fuel if you couldn't be near a methanol station, you could get some gasoline. Under those circumstances, there's essentially no ozone benefit whatever. And I have, by the way, extra copies of my remarks if someone would like them with all the references in them. It would reduce carbon monoxide, but that's almost anything would reduce carbon monoxide if you put oxygen in the fuel. Ethanol is made from corn in this country, and it's mostly a farm support program. And it, too, does not help with the ozone problems the way it is being now sold at 10% alcohol and 90% fuel. So, and moreover, the greenhouse, there's probably no greenhouse benefit with ethanol, even though it is made from biomass. And the reason for that is that there's so much energy in the cycle of growing corn and distilling the alcohol and so on. Compressed natural gas is the third one. That has some benefits, probably a 15% reduction in greenhouse gases per linear mile. It has definite ozone and CO benefits. But the benefit on climate, in my view, is not large enough. It's only a 15% benefit. Methane is moreover, natural gas is a depletable fossil fuel. And so in the longer term, we're going to have to find alternative sources to it. So these three carbon-based fuels that we hear so much about have some marginal benefits in cleaning up air quality, but they do not help the global warming problem. In my view, that is the most important problem we face in terms of long-term management of transportation. That leaves the other two, and you have to read my book to get the full story, which is electricity and hydrogen. Now, electricity is being, as you know, the whole electric vehicle era is being rushed in, not by the federal government, not by any of these sources, but by the state of California, which is trying to deal not with the climate problem, but with the air quality problem. And that's the rationale for introducing battery vehicles. Electric vehicles will be powered in the future either by batteries or by hydrogen fuel cells or by both, for that matter. There's no incompatibility with having both kinds of vehicles to be powered by. And if you ask the question, then, well, what are their benefits? How do they deal with these various problems? Well, clearly the benefits on air quality and climate depend on the sources of electricity. There's no question about it. And so studies have been done, California studies have been done in the Northeast. And it turns out that our power plants are fairly clean, and as a result, charging an electric battery car with present power plants would reduce hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide by about 99% below the cleanest car that has been constructed in this country, or actually constructed in Japan, as it turns out, the Honda, to meet the ultra-low emission vehicles standards in California. So these cars will be cleaner. It's not a matter of transferring pollution to the power plants. The power plants have much less pollution than cars do, and these cars will not deteriorate over time. The NOx benefits are something like 50% and depend very much on the controls from the power plants. However, the benefits on clean air would be greater because most of the charging would be done at night. The ozone requires sunlight to form. So by the morning, all this pollution would be gone. People do drive to their work. They would have basically emissionless vehicles. Now, you say, well, that's true, but you still have pollution. That is true. But in the longer term, we have to develop alternative sources of electric power. And these are either nuclear or solar sources. I think solar is going to make it photovoltaics, wind, solar thermal, and so on. And these, of course, emit no CO2 at all. So in the longer term, these battery vehicles powered by renewable resources would be sustainable. It would not depend on oil, have no air pollution, no greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from electric vehicles, it of course depends on the power mix. If you charge them, the worst case would be charging them with coal plants. And there you get about a 20% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. If you charge them with the natural gas plant, you get about a 50% reduction. If you charge them with hydro plants or nuclear plants or solar plants, you get about a 100% reduction in emissions. So these kinds of vehicles, which are admittedly have limits, the moment the range is about 100 miles with the best of the new battery. The average family in this country drives 40 miles per day on all its vehicles. And in California, where detailed studies have been done with consumers, educating them, asking them to keep a diary, it turns out most of the families with 2 cars could easily substitute an electric car and get almost the same performance, the same needs met with electric vehicles as they could with gasoline vehicles. So it would deal with 3 problems. It would essentially eliminate the smog and CO problems. It would drastically cut the greenhouse gas emissions in the long term, solve them. And it would deal with the security problem by providing electricity from domestic sources. Now, the second type of electric vehicle would be the hydrogen vehicle. Hydrogen is certainly a decade behind electric vehicles, mostly because there's no hydrogen infrastructure in place. We all have wires going into our homes. We don't have hydrogen pipelines going into our homes. And there are problems also with storing hydrogen on the vehicles. The optimal way has not been determined yet. You can liquefy hydrogen, which is very cold liquid gas, I think poses consumer problems, has problems. You can compress it, which is probably the way that will be initially introduced. You can store it as another chemical, for example, ammonia, which is a household cleaner, is made up of hydrogen and nitrogen, and it can be decomposed on a vehicle, and hydrogen can be reclaimed. And in fact, buses have been run, cars have been run, cars are running now at an engine at Johns Hopkins University on ammonia. It works, and it's unexplosive. It smells, but that at least tells you that it's there. Anyway, there's more technical research that needs to be done on ammonia. On hydrogen, hydrogen can be made from any source of electricity. So it's a renewable form. It doesn't have carbon in it, so it won't give you the carbon monoxide, it won't give you the hydrocarbons. Burned in the fuel cell, it will be very efficient and provide emissionless long-distance transport sometime in the future. So in my view, this linkages of problems dictates, if you look at the options, that we make the best effort we can in improving efficiency and cleaning up the present fleet of vehicles, but in the longer term, there's a certain inevitability about the electric and hydrogen vehicles. I should say there is one kind of battery that stands out among the most. It's made by an Israeli firm called Electric Fuels. And instead of charging the battery electrically, you go into the service station and they have a forklift. It just takes the batteries out and you put in the new ones. And those batteries have driven cars 400 miles non-stop. And it's zinc, it's a common element. It can be recycled in a refinery run by renewable resources. It gives you range and power of fossil fuels and will be emissionless as well. Okay, so to me, this is the fuel end of the problem. How we can get to sustainable transport in a way that solves all the problems together. I'd like to say just a few words about the need for the congestion. If we had all electric cars today, we still couldn't drive down Pennsylvania Avenue very far, and we'd still be stuck in traffic on the Beltway or wherever it is we came from. And this is the land use problem. And solving it is going to be very difficult because it involves patterns of living, where we work, where we live, and how we recreate, how we go shopping. And a lot tied up in the American psyche as to what the American dream is to live in the suburbs with a single family home, 2 cars, and you drive a short distance to work and a short distance to travel. And everything is free, by the way. Roads are free, and parking is free, and that's part of the problem, is that we're not pricing driving correctly in this country. Most Americans drive to free parking. If they had to pay for the parking, they would start carpooling, they would start vanpooling, they would start taking public transport. It's an economics problem that we refuse to face. We also refuse to face the fact that there are risks associated with burning oil and climate risks and security risks. We don't want to look at those or try and reflect those in the price either. As a result, that is underpriced. Congestion is what economists call an externality, and that's a price. There's a cost that we're not paying directly. We pay now, we basically ration highways now by congestion. And if we paid a price, a variable rate, like a telephone rate, or theaters do it, or whatever, you would start reducing transport demand and reducing congestion. A lot of people, it turns out only about 1/3 of the people on the road in the morning are going to work. The rest are going shopping, going to schools, taking their kids to daycare centers, dropping clothes off to the cleaners, and so on. So there's a lot of room for moving traffic on peak if we wanted to take a rational approach. But instead, we'll probably try and regulate it or something. At any rate, there are tools that we can use. I mentioned some of them, probably most of which are unacceptable in this country. Road pricing, it's called cashing out of parking or charging for parking. Then there is some technological fixes that we can use. The ITS, we've heard about that already. The intelligent transportation systems. Some of these provide information to consumers. I think that's fine. You can do it now by listening to the radio. And it tells you that there's congestion on this road, so you can take a different road. So that's fine. But it doesn't solve the problem, really, because it just sort of manages the congestion. It doesn't provide any motivation to get off the road or to find any other means of travel. There is one new technology, though, that is being evolved in this country, and there are about 4 companies that are developing it, one in an advanced stage, and Canadians are developing it also. And it's called personal rapid transit. And it basically takes your car, it makes it an electric car, and then it puts it on its own track, an elevated track. And because it's a small car, with, say, able to seat 4 people, the track is small, and the stands are small, the pylons are small. And as a result, the cost of the system is much less than the cost of the subway system. Subways cost $150 to $300 million a mile to build. It's extraordinarily expensive. These systems are expected to cost about a tenth of that, maybe $15 million per mile. They have the advantages that you have your own vehicle. You don't have to park it. You don't have to drive it. It takes you nonstop from the beginning to the end of your trip. And it's a very pleasant experience. You can read in it, and so forth. And at the present stage of this technology, the city of Chicago is funding co-construction with Raytheon Company of a prototype to be run in the suburb of Boston. That should be up and running in about a year from now. If that works as well as it's believed it will, then a full-scale small system will be built in Rosemont, Illinois, just outside of this O'Hare Airport, about which we've heard today. This kind of system offers promise that none of the other technological fixes can. It also could serve suburban sprawl, which we have in this country. I think it's probably easier to serve sprawl with this kind of technology than it is to try and get people to move into higher density developments, which is one option that's often proposed. Anyway, there are other variations on it, but basically the theme is the same: small cars on a track with frequent stations. And one of these tracks, by the way, with these vehicles could displace about 4 lanes of interstate highway, so you really can displace a lot of traffic. So let me then summarize. The problem, as I see it, is both a fuels problem and a land use problem. And in terms of the fuels problem, I think that if you look at the options, the problems that they're supposed to solve, that there are really fewer than you think. Electricity, one way or the other, is either as electrons or as hydrogen atoms, are going to be the long-term source. And California, I think, should be commended for backing into the solution, even though they didn't realize it at the time. And this is why I think California, the states of New York and Massachusetts should be supported in their attempts to get these cars on the road. And I think the way to get them, by the way, is to lease them, not to try and sell them. Lease them, people will be much more likely to use them and see how they work. The automakers may still take a little bit of an economic shock on these, but it'll provide the market that they need to do the mass production. So that, I think, is clear, and it has to be developed at the same time as you develop sustainable electric sources, and they'll complement each other very well. In the land use, I think ideally we want to deal in interim measures by using pricing more to get the problem under control, demand growth, congestion pricing, and parking pricing, and so on. But I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen in this country. At any rate, there are technological fixes we can deal with, and I think the PRT, which will be able to hopefully ride by the year 2000, expected to be up and running in Chicago, provide an alternative that is not only environmentally friendly, but which will be accessible for elderly, for children, and for handicapped persons at all. The two of these together, I think, will provide an environmentally friendly basis for sustainable transportation for the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. MacKenzie. So, question and answer.
I'm sure I've stepped on a lot of toes here, so I'm prepared to.
So, are there any questions?
I've been hearing these forecasts that the world is running out of oil. It goes back to the 1950s, the Club of Rome report in 1970s. What makes it different this time?
Well, you know, the first time this was done was in 1956. Hubbard gave a paper to the American Petroleum Institute in Texas, and he said, look, this is about what's available in the U.S., lower 48 states. And if you do the two curves, it comes around the year 1970. And I said, there's lots of oil. We're only a third of the way through. 1970, right on the button, it hit a peak and started declining. So I have one point that says it's going to happen. Alaska is another one. The estimates of Alaska was about 15 billion barrels. Put that under a curve, you get around 1988, and guess what? 1988, just like clockwork, Alaskan oil hit a peak. So I'd say the record is not bad. Now, in order to escape this argument, you have to assume that there's going to be like 3,000 or 3,500 billion barrels. And let me just give you one little quote on this issue by Richard Nearing, who did the report, and who, of course, faced the skeptics all the time. I quote, he says, higher estimates have been made, generally accompanied by criticisms of the consensus view, which he says is 2,000 barrels. Both these estimates and the accompanying critique of the consensus ignore the wealth of information available on world oil occurrence and the conditions determining it, and are generally based on an abstract speculation from a few facts about petroleum exploration. As a result, the implications of these estimates, such as substantial numbers of future supergiants and superprovince discoveries, are highly implausible. The consensus estimate provides a justifiable and reliable view of ultimate conventional resources. Now, the difference between the low and the high that I mentioned, 1,600, is 800 billion barrels. That's equivalent to all the oil that has been burned since oil was discovered up to today. And the difference in the time of peaking between those two estimates is about 10 years. So it really is quite insensitive to the amount of oil. But you may be right.
I was interested in your comments about the development of personal rapid transit, the PRT approach. It certainly sounds hopeful. However, I have some skepticism because back in the 1970s, I was in Morgantown, West Virginia, and I rode on a personal rapid transit vehicle, which I thoroughly enjoyed. However, I also was told that it was extremely costly. The DOT funded it, and the cost per passenger mile was absolutely exorbitant. So while it was interesting, it was very, it's just impossible to justify from an economic standpoint. So what's going to make the new personal rapid transit experience from an economic standpoint different from what I understood the experience to be in Morgantown, West Virginia?
Right, that's a good question. The Morgantown system was built in about 2 years, and it was not optimized. There are a lot of parameters to involve in this, like how big the vehicle is. I mean, the vehicle should be basically suited for the smallest number of passengers to avoid overcapacity. This system was a bus riding on this big, massive concrete throughway, and the systems to be economic have to be used a lot, and the vehicles have to be small. Now, you may be right. I mean, if the system in Chicago, for example, is not used enough, the cost per passenger may be $2 per trip, or $2.50 per trip, in which case it may not be used very much. Part of the problem is economics again, and that is that our motor vehicle drivers do not pay the full share of the cost we impose on society. We estimated that motor vehicle drivers in this country do not pay about $300 billion a year worth of costs related to both fuel and land use and infrastructure directly as user fees. As a result, everything is having trouble competing. So you may be right. We won't know for sure until the system is actually constructed and we have the price. It looks attractive, but you may be right. This gentleman up there who's been...
Hi, I'm Larry McGinn from the Transportation Branch of the Office of Management and Budget. And my question, I personally, and many other people I know in the federal government, share your concern about the multiple problems that we're facing and how to address those. And it's interesting, you praised the state of California for sort of falling into what you see as a wise policy. I wonder what your view of the federal role is in trying to solve these problems, especially given that for the foreseeable future we're facing much tighter budgets than we faced in the past decade or so. Right. So what do you see as the federal role in solving this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. First of all, I'm not really keen on regulating as the means of getting new technology into the marketplace. But there are 3 ways you can do things. You can price things right, you can regulate them, or you can subsidize them. The American way favors regulation and subsidy rather than pricing. So we're facing the problem of developing solutions that are uneconomic in the present context. And in this respect, I think California may be rushing a little bit too much, but basically is on the right track. The federal government, I think, has several responsibilities. First, it should be trying to get the prices right, which means that I think the federal tax on fuel should be increased gradually, giving people time, 10 cents a gallon per year for 10 years or more, to get the right motivation to get this problem under control. Secondly, the Fed should be supporting basic research in things like batteries and hydrogen fuel cells and so on. And third, the federal government is an enormous purchaser of vehicles, and in this respect, should show some preference in its purchasing policies towards sustainable transportation. The trouble with the federal government is that it tries to please everyone. And as a result, a lot of money is wasted on technologies that don't really make sense from a long-term perspective. Everybody knows this. So it's not something new.
More question?
Alan Miller from Center for Global Change, and to admit a potential conflict of former colleague Jim MacKenzie. Could you comment on, there was recently publicity, those from Japan may not also be aware of it, but the New York Times made a front page story about the environmental risk of lead from batteries due to a study that appeared, I think in Science by Charles Lave and Associates. And secondly, another recent article that attracted some attention was the one by Amory Lovins, which outlined the potential for a sort of supercar that would weigh 1/10 of the current weight and thereby achieve some incredible improvement in efficiency. Since both of those have been in the news of late and you tend to follow these developments, I'd be interested in your reaction.
Well, first of all, the story in the New York Times came out a full week before the paper was published in Science. I had a copy of the galleys, and there were so many inconsistencies between the galleys and the text that I didn't know what to believe. They had the weight, the batteries at 3,000 pounds when the whole car weighs less than that. So I don't know exactly what to expect. It is nonetheless proper to look at the fuel cycle, the battery recycling, to make sure that lead is not a big problem. I agree. We've got to have all these batteries recycled. Now, from reading that article, most of the emissions occurred, I think, in the mining and the smelting. And it's not as though it's in the city where the people are breathing the stuff. It's not, they gave the emissions in milligrams per kilometer, which is very misleading because it sounds like it's coming out of the car. It's not in the car. It's someplace in Utah where they're getting lead out of the ground. I fully support strong efforts to reduce those emissions. Lead is not the terminal battery in this case. It's likely to be either lithium-ion batteries or nickel-metal hydride batteries or zinc-air batteries. In any case, they have to be, and I think can be recycled rather straightforwardly because most people are going to have 600 pounds of these things in their car, and it's not as though you can just go pull one out. You have to go to a place that professionally does this, and they can ensure recyclability. I think the problem is worth addressing, but I'm not sure how serious it is because of the way the article was written. And I still haven't gotten the article. It's circulating through the office, and I haven't gotten it. And the other problem you mentioned, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Amory Lovins builds these imaginary cars which are made of composites and they weigh very little. And it turns out anything you can do to make the car lighter or have regenerative braking is fine. It basically all of that can be applied to electric vehicles with equal benefits. If you take a car and you take the gasoline version and you make an electric car out of it, then you can measure the efficiency of using electricity in the car, okay? Now, that's been done, and it's very straightforward, and it's a very good correlation between the two. Then you can imagine replacing the batteries with a generator, and then looking at the efficiency compared to the original gasoline cars, because there's oil in both cases. Turns out there's not a whole lot of difference. And from which I conclude that everything that Amory proposes to make cars very efficient could be applied to electric vehicles as well. I'm concerned about putting gasoline engines on cars because they're going to deteriorate just like every other gasoline engine is going to deteriorate. And so I'm not convinced that these will be clean over the long term. He thinks he can get cars to go 300 miles per gallon. Well, if they do that, they won't use much electricity either, the same kind of vehicle.
Okay, one more question. We have Amy.
I get it, Senator. I was delighted to hear you mention, although sort of softly, I think, the possibility of charging for using roadway during different periods of time. That wasn't exactly your phrasing, perhaps, but it seems to me there's just tremendous potential there, and we back away from that. But economist William Vickery, way back in the 1950s, did a study of the subsidy to rush hour commuters on urban expressways for commuting purposes. And he concluded that there was a tremendous subsidy, this was way back in the late 50s, and argued that there ought to be some peak load pricing. In other words, rush hour toll. It seems to me that argument is at least as valid now as it was then. It's politically difficult, of course, but I'd be interested in your response.
There are many, many papers that have documented the benefits of variable time of day pricing of roads to reduce peak demand. I don't think there's any question there's a benefit to it. The problem is political. People think they've paid for it already. They don't want to pay again. Even if you make it revenue neutral, you say we're going to reduce your income taxes, it's a hard sell. And from what I think, it'll be introduced on new roads or on existing toll roads where the prices are changed by time of day. It's most likely, but it's one of these solutions that begs for adoption, but it's a hard sell.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. MacKenzie.